sense of the news and information that's coming at us, whether it's about public health institutions like CDC or NIH, or whether it's about, the bird flu. How do you know who to trust? How do you make sense of headlines, whether it's from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or Rachel Maddow or Fox News? And how do you make sense of the information that's coming out of the wellness space on the internet, about mindfulness and how do you apply those messages to you? And I thought this is a great discussion in general. It's what I talk about with my patients every single day in my office because they're trying to make sense of their health and they're exposed to all this information as well. They have me as a filter, one filter. And I thought there's no better guest than Emily Oster, who has helped make sense of data since she was, I don't know, in the womb. And then I had fun during the pandemic trying to make sense of a chaotic time and the memories. So let me ask you, let me turn this into a question. How do you start to begin to help someone who's trying to make sense of a complex medical and health situation or piece of information when it comes to applying that information to themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I always want to give people is context for the things they hear. So I think so much of what is coming out in the messaging that one receives in the world is this I don't even know how to describe it. It's just like a lot of loud noise, and this study says, a new study says here, and a new and often it is almost never the case that a new study comes out that is unrelated to anything that has happened ever before. And
Right.
a really big piece of this is just telling people step back, what is the context for what you're seeing? What did we know about this before? And then put whatever new information is there in context. So that's always where I want to start. Part of what's hard is that's hard, right? People are hearing things all the time. Information is being pushed at you in a way that you're not maybe always ready to get it. And particularly in this moment, there is so much of that information that it's hard not to panic. It's hard not to overreact to individual pieces of things.
Yeah, I'd say that is a great first step. And I think it would be worth just to frame this conversation. There's the way I think about it, as I believe the way you may think about it, as a question, not a statement, which is that you have to start by, when you're trying to interpret information, medical news, whether it's about your own health or it's in the New York Times or a headline about the bird flu, you have to first start with the context. I mean, I actually might back it up first, Emily. I might say, you have to start with understanding who the source of the information is, but that is, that's neck and neck with contextualize. I think you're right that context always matters. And I think one of the challenges that we don't always get the context we need when a news story is coming out, whether it's about bird flu or about, COVID for 4 years, whether it's about, breast cancer and should I get a breast MRI with my mammogram or should I just get a mammogram because I have dense breasts? So the context is not always presented. Like science communication, I think, is difficult at best. And I think communicating context and then reaching a wide audience with the context that everyone who's reading needs is intrinsically impossible. But the best science communicators, in my mind, and I think that includes you, is someone who has access to the facts, who doesn't have an agenda to like a political agenda or ideology, and who is able to give context where context is as important as the fact and nugget that is being transmitted in the first place.
Yeah, I think the best scientific communication sort of explains to people this is what I know, this is what I think is true, this is why I think it's true, and this is the information that we still need and where we are still uncertain. And sort of those pieces delivered in a way that people can understand. That's the core to scientific communication. I think so much of what actually comes out of scientific communication is just do what I said, I'm an expert. And that's a pretty crummy, not from doctors, but from the sort of
yes, from doctors.
And
no, throw it back at doctors, Emily and I. We are not, just because we're doctors doesn't mean we are good communicators. In fact, I think that we have to have humility about the fact that we as physicians often assume people have the same tolerance for risk that we do.
Right.
that we have the same sort of worldviews, that we have the same access to information, and that we have the same like barriers to activating, to operationalizing a plan. In other words, yes, doctors are the first. I mean, I love doctors. I am a doctor. I love my doctor friends, and everybody in medicine that I know wants to do a good job and contextualize information and communicate it with nuance. Because of limitations on doctors' time, because doctors are not trained in communicating nuance to other people other than one at a time on patients, there and because doctors, I think, sometimes have a low risk tolerance themselves, like we're like anxious little gang. Um, we often do the like uh, I'm not going to explain the context here. You just got to do it. Like, I'm not going to tell you why you need to take Lipitor or this chemotherapy drug, or you just do it.
Yeah,
And
I think
that, to
it's
me, is the first place to erode trust.
yeah, I think the other tricky thing, which sometimes gets in the way of communication, is jargon. So particularly when we are pressed
Yes.
for time, which is true always, and I think especially true in, like, medical visits, there is a sort of there is a shorthand that you use, that because you are very familiar with things, and there's a sort of set of a way that you would communicate talking to another person with the same kind of expertise. I have the same, like, when I talk to other economists, there's things where you can go much faster because we have a shared language. But that jargon in the context of medicine can sometimes be quite scary for people, and it's hard to be like, I don't understand what you're saying, and like stop. You need to back up, because people don't want to say that. But if you don't if you there's jargon and then they don't understand, then people get nervous, they get scared, and they kind of shut down, and then they're not really listening. And it can actually be quite hard to tell if someone is unable to, like, it can be hard to tell whether that's what's going on.
Yeah,
And I think we don't train people to, like, de-jargon themselves.
I think that's true. And so when it comes to, you know, when I think about what patients ask me about every day in my office, I mean, they're asking me about like, why do I have a cold, or why do I have diarrhea, or why am I tired all the time? They're also asking me. The New York Times just reported on a study about the bird flu. The New York Times or someone else is writing about a child who died from the measles. Should I get an MMR booster? And so, from my standpoint, I have like the utmost empathy for people who are looking at all of this information coming at them, like information coming at them, not just about health, but about everything in the world, but particularly about health. They're trying to interpret this or trying to make sense. And like my patients have me, but not, more than 80 million Americans don't have access to a doctor who can answer that question for them. So when you're trying to interpret news and information and you're like, oh my God, someone died from measles, like, did I have a booster? Like, do I need a booster? Am I going to die from measles? Is that cold I have? Is that rash I have? Like the measles? Like, I have so much empathy for people who don't have the context or access to the information. So when someone like on my newsletter is asking me like, how do I live in Texas. I don't have a doctor, or I do have a doctor and she gives me 5 minutes and I don't know who to talk to when I have these questions. How do you recommend to someone who's out there reading the news to like understand how things apply to them? I mean, that's an impossible question to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very hard. I think, asking your question in the right, like, framing your question in the right way, is probably the fastest way to get to an answer that you want. And I think that a little bit of homework can sometimes help patients frame the question in a way that they can get an actual answer. I think when you come into the doctor and you're like, I've heard all this stuff about measles, and like, I just like, I should be doing something. That's like very hard. That's actually quite hard to engage with.
It's a
Um,
great. That's a money point. That is a money point. Like, do you know SBAR?
no,
Okay, it's like a. I didn't go to business school, but it's like a business school way of communicating. It's like
I taught at a business school, but they don't teach you that. They let you teach without knowing
it's
it.
all like business school has all this like jargon that I'm like, all right,
So
you guys
they
over
love the
there,
acronyms.
whatevs. But the point of SBAR is I don't even know what it stands for. But the point is like it's about like, here's the situation, here's the background, SB, here's the da 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 da, and here's the proposed. Like, it's coming to a query, or coming to someone else with a question that is like organized and like clear about what you're asking. Because if someone comes to me as a patient is like, the measles, like I'm like, okay, like are you talking about your grandchild? Are you talking about did you have a shot? Like, what is your question? And that helps doctors so much. And it's not that we can't do the like I can do all day long, but what is it? Are we talking about anxiety? Are we talking about the shot? Are we talking about your grandchild? Come prepared a little bit. That helps doctors. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think, coming prepared and thinking like, what is the question I want the answer to, or what is the scope of changes I would be willing to make? I would like, I'm traveling. I am or am not willing to like not travel with my kid, to travel with my kid if they have a measles vaccine, like whatever it is, sort of thinking about like, framing the question. What is the actual question I want to have answered so you can get further in the conversation? And I also think always for people, I just want to be like, like worrying is not helpful. Like, we sort of distinguishing between like just literally worrying about things that you have no control over and like things that you can actually make choices about. And
That's
in the
tricky.
current moment is tricky because like I am worried about cuts to NIH funding. I am very worried about them,
I'm
but
very worried about it. I think people will lose their jobs. I think there will be people in our country who will lose their lives as a result of these NIH cuts. Not I think, I know they will.
and then the question is, but like, what should people? Would be great if we could give people a way to like think about like what can you do, like what is it that you should be doing about that, as opposed to just are you worried about it, which like yes you might be worried about it, but worrying about it is not itself like a productive activity.
Yeah, I mean, my job as a primary care doctor is to help people calibrate their level of worry to the degree of actual threat. And then, as you said, and but that requires access to the facts about the situation and access to knowing where you don't have control and knowing where you do have control. So like if someone has a new diagnosis of breast cancer, for example, my job isn't to say, "Oh, don't worry about it." And indeed, worry is not going to make your life better, but you're entitled to worry about it. The question is, how much should you worry about it, and where do you want to put that worry? Do you want to channel worry into getting to opinions from experts so you know exactly what you're doing and you have agency there? Or do you want to channel your worry into like a therapist's office to work on worry itself, which is unproductive? So worry is a natural response to headlines, fear-based, outrage-inducing headlines, which is not to say that there isn't fear, there isn't outrage to be had. It is to say that know that those are emotions that should be metabolized somewhere, either by metabolizing the energy, the anxiety, and the outrage somewhere else, like on a jog or I know I mean, maybe that's probably where you
Yeah, that's where I'm
process.
like, I'm on like, yeah, it's a very stressful time. I'm at like 55 miles a week of
Yeah,
stress.
I bet you're running like 5 mile an hour, like a 5 minute mile at this point,
Right,
like
no,
given right.
if only.
And I metabolize stress, anxiety, and like overwhelm in yoga. Like I really do. Like I mean, I used to do it because it was like something to do with your friends, and I like the tights, and now it's actually like necessary. Um, but I think you're right. Like the calibrating anxiety to the level of threat and having compassion for your anxiety, but also not leading with anxiety when you make decisions is like life's work.
But I
But,
think this gets
yeah,
to, I think, a question about this sort of going back to what you asked in the beginning about like how are we communicating things to people? I think there's a piece of sort of risk communication which is about how large is this risk, and this is not so much about these sort of like big existential threats that we don't really totally understand, but more like I have this piece of health information, or like I'm worried about the measles. I think we can give people a sense of like how likely is this? And that comes up in things like cancer screening. Like, you have like one of, I think, the most valuable things my primary care doctor ever said to me was like when I was going to go have my first mammogram, she was like, I just want you to know they always find something on the first one if you're like a thin lady. And I was like, okay, they didn't find anything, but like the sort of dialing down of anxiety with sort of this idea of like, just so you understand, like, here is the kind of idea about false positives. Here's what we'd actually learn from, here's a way in which you can put what happens in context. I think Really, really
That is
important.
such a gift from your doctor. And I'm sitting on my exam table right now because my internet is unstable. That is such a gift from your doctor to contextualize it up front too. I mean, because she's not saying to you, if you have a mammogram that's abnormal, just ignore it. She's saying go in with the context and the framing on what is the likelihood of having a true positive over
Right.
a false positive. And like, I think it's such a good point, Emily, the idea of like relative risk and absolute risk, which is like not well understood. Like
Not
people
well.
don't, right. So like, look, if you take the if you take hormone replacement therapy, let's just talk about that for 1 minute. HRT,
Hmm.
hormone replacement therapy, was messaged since the 90s after the Women's Health Initiative came out and they halted the trial to like, stop the presses and say, look, looks like HRT is causing breast cancer. Okay, so then, people were stopped taking their HRT. And since then, unfortunately, there's been a countervailing, there's been a message to the general public that has been relatively inaccurate, saying that HRT causes breast cancer.
Right.
So that narrative has been really hard to undo. And the truth of the matter is that HRT doesn't cause breast cancer. Being a woman causes breast cancer. Being a
Older.
woman is associated with hormones. And yes, if you have a hormone sensitive tumor, it can be watered, so to speak, by hormone therapy. So, one of the ways that I'm getting to a point here. One of the ways in which I help patients understand the risk of breast cancer, not from HRT, result of HRT, but it as a potential kind of correlation to HRT is to break down the absolute risk and the relative risk. Like the risk of it getting breast cancer is 1 in 8 women. Adding HRT is not going to meaningfully increase your risk. It means that you're going to get you screened more readily. And by the way, if you look back at the actual data from the Women's Health Initiative, where the messaging sprung out from it that HRT causes breast cancer, it was the progesterone only arm, and the actual increased risk was minuscule.
So this is an example of a place where I think, the messaging got very confused and very
Mangled.
damaging, but it is hard to message, right? Because you just said a bunch of stuff, which I totally understand and I think like very sensible, but it's also like hard and detailed. Like, okay, here is why I think that this study isn't relevant. Everybody was much older. Like we really ideally would be treating HRT when people, with HRT when people are younger because that's when the symptoms. We're not going to take women in their late 60s. Typically, that's like maybe not the ideal population. There was a different kind of progesterone. So all of these details, which are going into your understanding of like why presumably this is something you often do prescribe for people in certain circumstances. And on top of this, like actually the relative increase in the risk of breast cancer, the absolute increase is very small. But there's so much in there, and it gets boiled down to like HRT causes breast cancer, and then you can't be like, there's no chance that it causes. You're not just like, well, that's a myth. Like,
So this is actually such a good example. What you just said could not be truer. That And this is kind of where we are in the dialogue, not just about HRT, but about whether it's about Ozempic and weight loss, whether it's about, antidepressants versus lifestyle. Like we're in this era of sort of the Crips and the Bloods, the do this and do that, the polar opposites. So we have, because of the mangled messaging out of the Women's Health Initiative about HRT causes breast cancer, we have birthed an industry of menopause, which great. It is menopause practitioners and menopause messengers. Fantastic. We need women like Mary Claire Haver, who's a friend of mine, Rachel Rubin, Kelly Casperson. We need you guys to be messaging correctly about the harms of the harms of estrogen depletion, the harms of not being on HRT. And please do not evangelize HRT. Do not evangelize HRT because it is so nuanced. One patient at a time has to be assessed. Not every woman should be on HRT. It is possible that estrogen can accelerate an estrogen sensitive breast cancer. Do I know if you're going to get that when I'm looking at your normal mammogram and your negative BRCA test? No idea. So like we have to be humble about what we don't know, and we have to be humble about the nuance in the middle. And that is where we are failing people in science communication, and that is where headlines fail people every day, because there's the data, we don't know who to trust, communications are not contextualized, and then there's an evangelism about, Ozempic or personal optimization from different messengers that actually deprives people of agency, because it's not about who to believe, it's about who do I who is in the arsenal of people I trust, and then how do I make the decision for myself based on my own health information.
But this is the last piece. This sort of based on my whole health information and based on my own preferences, where I think often these things are sort of missing. Like it becomes up in the HRT discussion because some people's perimenopause and menopause symptoms are much worse than other
Right.
people, and
Yep.
so this sort of like you are like that is something we need to think about. Like how much is this bothering you? How to what extent is this something that you would like to address? And that's about preferences.
Yeah,
So
and like if you're if
everyone
you're
want this. I don't know.
yeah, and if your mom had breast cancer and she was on HRT, and you believe that the HRT caused her breast cancer, like I can't prove that you're wrong, and I don't blame you for having a feeling about HRT that is your feeling, not mine. As long as you have access to the data and the facts and your options, like my job is to hand you the power, not to lord the power over you, or to tell you that you should see a menopause practitioner and always be on HRT because that's the thing to do in 2025. And that's what medicine is failing people on. That's what science communication fails people on. And it's impossible to message mass amounts of people, see pandemic, on risk tolerance, the nuances of information, the data, who's at highest risk for COVID. Is it the 20-year-old who's locked up in their dorm room, or is it the 90-year-old who's
That
frail in a nursing home? Like
one we know.
we crapped the bed on on science communication, and you and I both realize that. And I was not a perfect communicator either. I certainly swiped at people on Twitter, but I'm just saying, yes, we have to know who to trust. And I think I'd love to hear from you, Emily, like what are the sort of ingredients that you need to trust someone else to message information, because you are not your own doctor, you're not your own gynecologist, you're not your own, right? Like so what is the anatomy of trust in your book?
So I think I a lot of my trust is sort of when I'm going to trust in someone who's an expert, recognizing the sort of limits of all of the expertise. And like I try very hard to be clear. Like I'm trained as an economist, I am an expert in data. Like that is my area of expertise. I'm really really good at data and causality. That's what I do my work on. And I'm pretty good at like communication and understanding how to coordinate, like explain risk. When I go to my primary care doctor, who I really trust, she has a set of expertise that I do not have in like clinical practice, in based on having seen patients, based on knowing a lot of things about the human body because she went to medical school. And so I think the ideal relationships there and the ideal sort of trust building is when people come who from the like and everyone brings the expertise that they have and they like come together and those expertises overlap. When I write, my co-author on my book about complicated pregnancy is Nate Fox. He's an MFM, and we write together. Like I'm bringing one thing, he's bringing another thing. And for me to trust somebody on that, I think it is this piece of sort of having people who kind of know know the limits of their expertise, but also are willing to like say I don't know, or this is what I think based on this. I had one of the only conflicts I've had with my doctor is when I got some elevated liver test, liver enzyme thing, and she was like, "I want you to have like a liver ultrasound."
You're like, no,
And
I just need to stop taking Advil, and like,
no, I was like, you don't understand. Like, this is a thing that happens after workouts. I was like, here's an academic paper about like I had this blood test right after I did a very hard workout. Like, this is like an elevated muscle enzyme. And she was like, you know what? I just would feel better. Like, you're already going for a sonogram for your dense breast. Like, could you please just have an ultrasound at the same time? And if it looks good, then we will never talk about this again. And I was like, fine. Like, and she wasn't like, you're stupid. You don't know what you're talking about. She was just like, it would make me feel better because of I hear what you're saying, and maybe you are right, but it would make me feel better if you would do this. And I think that kind of ability to communicate and say, like, here's why I think the thing that I'm thinking And I respect that you think a different thing. Here's why I still recommend that you do this. That really, for me, that kind of like openness is a core to trust. And I just want to say that I was totally right. I
Oh,
did not.
I mean, that had to be said. That had to be said. I mean, I was not gonna let you off the hook on the end of the story. But assuming that you're sitting here alive, so what I'm hearing you say, Emily, is that some important ingredients in trust, especially when it comes to health and medical information, whether it's in your doctor's office or reading a headline in CNN. I think you have to. What I'm hearing you say is that there has to be a humility about what you don't know,
Yes.
and it's not even the person who's the author of a article. It's about what is not known about the
In the
situation.
world.
Like
Yeah.
certainty about things that are, particularly if it's not in your area of expertise, is kind of a red flag. Not is it kind of a red flag, it's a red flag. I think so. Like, make humility great again. Secondly, go to the people who are trained experts in the thing you are going to see. Like, don't go to the hardware store for milk, right? Like, don't go to the chiropractor to ask about your risk for pancreatic cancer.
Right.
I think that's unfortunately where we're heading sometimes. And I, with all respect for chiropractors, I think chiropractors are fantastic at what they do. But like, I would no more counsel someone on, you know, I don't know, like how to operate their auto. Actually, that's not true. I would tell my kids how to deal with our car because, but I'm just saying, like, I try to remain in my lane, so to speak. I kind of hate it when people say stay in your lane, but like, I think we need the ability to be humble, the ability to understand what we know and what we don't know, and the ability, as you just said, also to collaborate with others and for your mind to be changed.
Right.
A flexibility of thought for your mind to be changed. And then being able to communicate that to other people. I know what I know. I know what I don't know. Here's what I recommend. I could be wrong. And here's who you might ask if you wanted another thought about it. And if you can bring those tenets to like how you read the news, I think that could be helpful.
Yes, but it's very hard to bring those tenets. And I also think that it is hard to communicate with that kind of nuance to people because a lot of times what people want is just to be told like an answer. People love an answer. And I mean, I get that. I would much prefer an answer some of the time. And I think where we make mistakes is when sort of communication gives those answers, especially when we are very uncertain. And then we have to go back and be like, oh, actually, I was wrong, even though I sounded very confident in this and thing. And I think that, during the pandemic, I think that was sort of a huge risk is to say it was, or a huge like misstep was saying very confident things. And then 5 minutes later saying that actually the opposite was true. Like, sorry. You really need to if you're going to do that, you really need to understand why you changed your mind. You got to be really careful because once you lose trust, it's very hard to get it.
That's exactly right. I mean, I think we're in a trust desert right now when it comes to science and medicine. I mean, public trust in institutions is at a low. Public trust in like public health and in doctors is at all time low. And I understand those reasons. I absolutely do. I mean, our healthcare system is so broken. It's so fragmented. People don't have either access to someone who can help them answer complicated questions or even simple questions, and then they're either given 5 minutes, and then of course, even the most well-intended doctors who want to give good, nuanced communication and information, there's just no time and there's not enough doctors to do it.
So,
And then you birth the wellness industry. You birth, you know, who also are in many cases well-intended. Like, who doesn't want to be well? Who doesn't think that yoga and meditation and sleep and exercise and nutritious eating isn't
but
good for you?
okay,
It is.
here is my problem with this space, which is I think it's completely fine to tell people like, there is a marginal benefit, like to tell people like it would be good if went outside every morning and had lemon water before you had your coffee because you kind of an elevated cortisol. Like, okay, look, I am a person who's constantly trying to like optimize. Like, I will tell you, Lucy, I drink bovine colostrum because I read a study that tells me that it improves GI distress and it really works for me. Okay. And I
Fine,
get it.
fine,
I
fine,
get it.
fine, fine. No judgment, no judgment.
I mean, you can judge, but I wouldn't say that. Like, I wouldn't tell other people to do this. I would just say this is a thing that I do. I think where this all becomes a problem is when we talk about these things like they're all equally important.
You
Like
said it.
it's
Yes.
like it's like to sort of be like, you know what? If you are basically like eating some vegetables and you're not like limiting obesity, eating some vegetables, doing some exercise, some kind of exercise, 30 minutes 4 times a week, like those things are really pretty crucial. And many people are not doing those. First, do those things. Then later, we can talk about lemon water. But like going outside with a cup of lemon water is not a substitute for like exercise. You know what I'm saying?
I
Like,
100, yeah, the valence on each of these lifestyle things, it has to be communicated. Like exercising is, on a regular basis is much more important than say taking a fish oil supplement. Of course, it depends on who you are. My biggest problem with the wellness industry, with a huge caveat saying that wellness is good and wellness is why I think I have a job and career and profession, the wellness industry to me is defined as people who are for profit recommending
yeah,
non-nuanced
totally,
products and lifestyles that
totally.
are a not sustainable, a not realistic, and actually my biggest problem with it is not so much that they don't message what's more important. That is a problem. It's more that there's a suggestion, and I'm going to say suggestion because it's not always true, a suggestion that if you were to exercise, if you were to eat healthy, if you were to count your macros and you were to, meditate, then you will be healthy. When you can count your macros and intermittently fast and get pancreatic cancer. You
Yes,
can sleep 8 hours and have a really healthy relationship with your spouse and talk and open ended conversations and still have an anxiety disorder, depression. You can do all the personal optimization you want. You can have a continuous glucose monitor, even if you don't have diabetes. And all that data does is give you a sense of control, which may be important to you, but it's not the same as getting your checkup, talking to your doctor, making sure you're caring for your mental health in an actual way. Because mental health that is just treated as like, mindfulness is just, for some people that's enough, but for some people they actually need like medications and psychotherapy and, so I guess that's my big beef. If you can't tell, and this is actually what
yeah,
my book is about, is like why the wellness industry was born, how the medical industrial complex is failing people, even though both industries are well intended in many ways, and how to navigate the choppy sea between them, which is not a pretty ocean right now because there are not a lot of nuanced messengers out there.
yeah, totally. And I think so I've been doing on parent data. We have some new work on for infertility, some new like writing on infertility, and I think one of the things that's very clear in that space is this kind of like almost predatory wellness aspect. It's like, well, you're not getting pregnant. Like if only you took this set of supplements, like did this cleanse, like did and I think that's really preying on most of those things are not evidence based, and it's really preying on a kind of situation in which people are kind of desperate for any type of helpful guidance. And that's not great. I don't like that.
Yeah, it's really inhumane, right? I mean, I think the diet industry is basically profiting off of women's, generally wobbly body image and shame about their bodies and fear about diabetes. That's not to say that every diet company or every health or nutrition coach is like, evil at all. It is true. Two things can be true at once, right? Like it can be true that healthy eating and maintaining a healthy body weight and BMI and your metabolic health is healthy and good and prevents heart attack and stroke and limits your risk for diabetes or complications thereof. It can also be true that we do harm to people when we suggest that there's an absolute solution that is, do or die, and I have the answers, and this is the diet you need to follow, and Ozempic is evil, and you know, it's just about personal optimization, and what's your problem? So,
Right.
like, that's my beef with the wellness industry that is sometimes cloaked in like metabolic health, and whether it comes to infertility, as it sounds like, I didn't realize there was this like predatorial, or the parent, right? Like the pressures we put on young mothers to like, breastfeed and warm the baby wipes so they're at the perfect temperature to touch your baby's bottom. I mean, I am so glad I'm not a mother in this era. I mean, I'm a new mother. I am a mother now, but I just think it's a lot of pressure, and I think it's a lot of pressure on women, which is a totally different subject.
Yes, totally different subject. No, I mean, I think all of these places where there's like where people really want to sort of do it right, you get this. There is the opportunity to tell people they're doing it wrong, And when you tell people you're doing it wrong, and they could do it right if they only, paid its money or clicked on this link. That's like just that's clickbait.
It's clickbait, and there's also the privilege factor of like all of these things are expensive, like to buy a baby diaper warmer or to do a cleanse or all these things are expensive, and so the wellness industry, like while it's trying to like democratize health information, sometimes does more harm. And I think you know doctors are no saints in this, right? Like in order to practice medicine the way I want to, I had to build my own practice,
Right.
and that there's intrinsic you know dissonance there because I want to be able to help people who are beyond the walls of my office. Part of why I'm doing this stuff and writing my book, but it's not enough, right? Like there's not enough access to nuanced information and straight talk. And I'm just one person, you're just one person, but I think what else do you have to recommend to listeners who are trying to like digest headlines from New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal that are fear-based and outrage-inducing, even though fear and outrage is warranted in many cases.
I mean, I guess I always just want people to like choose their moments to digest things.
That's a
Like
good
you don't
point.
have to read this right now because it's in your feed. You can read it later when you're ready to digest it and you have a minute. Like the things that are the worst is when we read the headline, we don't have time to see the article, and like we sort of we miss even the tiny amount of nuance that they might have in the full text. And I think that's where like there is some maybe curation of one's information diet, not so much in like what you look at, but like when you're looking at it, that can be helpful, particularly if you are someone who really sort of struggles with this kind of with anxiety around like sort of information overload.
You know what I love doing? This is just like a little technique I've started using because I subscribe to a lot of like health news outlets that like come into my email. Is I will future date an email to myself about it. Like if I'm going to go see my primary care doctor and I want to be able to ask something, even though I'm a primary care doctor, I pretend that I'm not in my own doctor's office, and I'll future date that news feed to come into my at the same time of my appointment. So when I see that someone died from measles, as they did this week, an unvaccinated child, I will shoot that email to my from the headlines from the New York Times into the my scheduled appointment with my doctor to be like, hey, did you ever check my titers? I don't know, basically like just sort information to, and that takes some organizational stuff and I'm not great at it. And then I'll cancel my doctor's appointment and then I'm well, you know how it goes. But
Overnight.
the point is to your point is well taken, Emily, to curate the sources of information that you look at. Try to read things that are based in fact and truth and give you context that you need. And if you don't have the context you need, you don't and it's then take it to the expert that
Yeah.
might be able to help you with it. Don't go to the hardware store for milk. And then realize where you have agency and realize where anxiety is just anxiety that you're entitled to, but that may not be helping you.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the other thing is, pick like try to pick the sources that you trust in the first place. I mean, I think, the thing that is that makes me happiest is when people tell me like, I was worried about this, but then I stopped reading because I knew that you would write about it. And I was just waiting for you to tell me like how I should think about it. Not like waiting for you to tell me how I should think about it, but like basically I was waiting for you to tell me the context. And like that's for me, that's like my job is to try to take some of these things that freak people out and be like, take a step back. Like, actually, this thing about plastic utensils is not what you think it is, and like step it back. And I think that's if you can choose some of the people that you're comfortable getting this information from that you trust, I think that can be really helpful.
Absolutely. Patients will ask me, and people on my newsletter will ask me, like, what are the best sources of news, of information? And it's really hard to answer because you can look at Mayo Clinic or Harvard Medical School letter, and there's information there, but their information is more like encyclopedic knowledge. It's not contextualized. I mean, it's often not wrong, but it's often like too much information without enough context. So then people go on like ChatGPT, and by the way, ChatGPT is pretty darn. I mean, I may be out of a job, in 6 months, but it's pretty good. But then you don't know what context to feed it. You are being asked to give the context. It can't ask you like, oh, did you, is your headache hurting because you just, something you don't know to even report in the first place. So, as I say to patients all the time, you can scare the crap out of yourself all day long if you want to by going on Google and ChatGPT and looking at Harvard Health Letter. And so it's not so much like that Harvard Health Letter or Cleveland Clinic, even though they're reputable places, are wrong. It's more that you need context and you need to curate and trim the amount of information you're getting in the first place, and then take the anxiety to the person who either is the person who manages your anxiety, your yoga instructor, your therapist, your nature trail walk, or to your doctor to help them calibrate anxiety to the level of actual threat to you.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's, if you can do that, I think you're in a much better position to both navigate the information that's coming in and to, try to live in a less anxious way in a very, very anxious moment.
The last thing I want to just ask you about, Emily, and then I'll let you go, is the concept of harm reduction is such an important one. Harm reduction is the concept in public health that risk is everywhere and you
Right.
cannot make it zero. You cannot make risk zero. You can't, like, for example, if I were to make risk, try to tack down risk to zero for my young adult children, I'd say never drive a car, never drink a beer, never be in a sexual relationship, like basically just don't leave the house.
Yeah.
And then they would not have a life. So we have to recognize and then communicate as you as a science communicator, me as a doctor, science communicator, how important it is to recognize that there's no menu option to have zero risk. Like, you can't live in a world that's risk free. So you have to then recognize what the trade-offs are when you're trying to mitigate a risk. If you want to mitigate the risk of not having microplastics in your brain, and that involves taking all your silverware and not going to picnics anymore, and that's up to you. But let's calibrate the risk to the actual threat, and then understand that there's no zero risk in anything. Is that how you would say it?
Yeah, I think that's how I would say it. I mean, I think that a different way to say it is that all options have risk. So, sometimes, and I think for parents, this is kind of like I could let my kid walk themselves to school. And I think that's a kind of thing that parents, used to do more of, they do less of. And I think some of it is people are very worried, like, oh, what if they get kidnapped? What if they get hit by a car? These are like, I'm letting the kid out, without me. And like, some of those risks are sort of like, he's not going to get kidnapped. But like, there are some real risks. Cars are a real risk. The risk is small, but it's not zero. But I think, just to frame, like, if you never let your kid go out by themselves, like, that's also a risk. That's a risk of not developing independence. It's not a physical risk in the moment, but it's a risk nonetheless. And we are too often framing as like, there's risky and there's safe. Like, there's no safe. There's like risky and other risky, different kinds of risky, and uh you can't pick the perfect only safe option. Like, having your kid live in your basement and never leave is perhaps physically quite safe, but is in many other ways tremendously unsafe. And if we frame it like that, I think it makes it a little bit easier for people to take on some of those more salient risks. And one of the things we know, parenting space and stuff like this, is like, once you take the risk, one that, like, it's hardest to do the first. The first time you let your kid walk to school is the most stressful, and then the second time is only a little stressful. Then after that, you kind of forget about it. So there's a receding into the background of risk, but I think the most important piece of this is just to recognize that there are not like true safe, no perfect safe option.
That's right. There are degrees of risk, there's degrees of safety, and then there are trade-offs in every decision we make. Like HRT, there's a risk of taking HRT, hormone replacement therapy, and there's a risk of not taking hormone replacement therapy. So we have to countenance both sides of the coin and recognize that neither decision is risk-free. And that's, I think, where, certainty in this era of confusion over information overload, certainty is at such a premium. Like, people are
Yeah,
looking for certainty. They're looking to know and to be sure. And
yeah,
that, unfortunately, is never going to be true. Unfortunately, the absence of 100% certainty about the 100% safety of every vaccine ever is what's being leveraged to then wage a war against
yeah,
vaccines. So we have to know what we're dealing with, what we're looking at, who the messenger is, what the context is, how to get more context, how to curate our information, how to prune the amount of information, how to manage our anxiety, understand risk, our own personal risk tolerances, and then just wake up and do it all over again. I mean, that's just like,
That's why we have a job.
that's why we have a job. Emily, it's so fun talking to you because
So fun.
you're so smart, and it's so just harkens me back to the days of risk tolerance conversations from the
Yeah.
pandemic where I first met you, and we were trying to help people calibrate risk to the degree of threat, and then got hosed by the readers of our pieces in the Atlantic.
We were right at
Um,
the end. We
was
were right.
that?
We were right in the end.
I mean, can we just
Fair
say
enough.
it from the hill? I mean, from the hilltops.
Okay.
Like, I mean, yeah, yep,
Ah,
yep. So
good.
anyway,
Thank
Emily,
you.
it's great to talk to you, and have a great weekend.
All right, you too.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.